How should we interpret the Constitution? In this video, I'll be looking at two kinds of originalism. Gary Lawson will represent the view that the correct interpretation of the Constitution involves looking at the original public meaning of its words and phrases. Zachary Pohlman will represent the idea that we look at the intention of the authors and not their exact words. In his article on reading recipes and constitutions, Gary Lawson compares the task of interpreting the Constitution to the task of interpreting a 250-year-old chicken recipe one finds in the attic. A recipe for fried chicken is a set of instructions. To follow the recipe is to follow that set of instructions. To understand what the instructions are instructing you to do, you look for the original public meaning of the terms and phrases contained in the recipe. So, by analogy, the Constitution is a set of instructions for running the government. To follow the Constitution is to follow that set of instructions. To understand what the instructions are instructing you to do, you look for the original public meaning of the terms and phrases contained in the Constitution. Lawson writes, quote, "The Constitution of the United States is a recipe for a particular form of government. It aims at certain ends, though the extent to which following the recipe will achieve those ends is a question for inquiry. As a recipe of sorts that is clearly addressed to an external audience, the Constitution's meaning is its original public meaning. Other approaches to interpretation are simply wrong. Interpreting the Constitution is no more difficult and no more different in principle than interpreting a late 18th century recipe for fried chicken." End quote. Before getting into his argument, Lawson gives us a distinction between interpretation and adjudication. Basically, this is a distinction between what the recipe says to do and whether you should use the recipe in planning the family dinner. It's a distinction between what the instructions tell us to do and whether following the instructions would make something worth eating. There's also a distinction between what the Constitution tells us to do and whether those instructions are worth following. Interpretation, according to Lawson, concerns the meaning of the Constitution. Questions of interpretation attempt to answer the question, what does the Constitution command us to do? Questions of adjudication, on the other hand, asks, should we do what the Constitution tells us to do? To better understand the distinction between the two, let's assume that your boss commands you to put some merchandise in her car and then report it as missing so that she can collect insurance on it. You have two questions to answer. The first question is, what did your boss tell you to do? The second, should you do it? It would be a mistake, according to Lawson, for you to begin by trying to decide what you should do and then use that to interpret your boss's command. To say in effect that since it would be wrong for you to put some company merchandise in your boss's car and then report it as missing, your boss could not have commanded you to do that. So, for example, concerning the constitutionality of slavery before 1865, a judge cannot say, according to Lawson, since slavery is wrong, the Constitution cannot possibly provide instructions to protect slavery. In fact, the Constitution did protect slavery, even though it was wrong. This point may seem obvious, but I want you to pay attention to something. Pay attention to how often people argue from the premise that such and such is a good idea to the conclusion that the Constitution protects it, or from the premise that something is a bad idea to the conclusion that the Constitution does not protect it. It would be like finding a chicken recipe written 250 years ago and deciding first how one would go about making a good-tasting fried chicken, and then interpreting the recipe as telling you to do exactly that. That's just not how interpretation works. So let's get into specifics. Lawson asks the reader to imagine finding a recipe of fried chicken. He then asks us to consider how we would find out what the recipe says. In his article, he gives us an example of a fried chicken recipe for us to follow. It calls for 2.5 pounds of chicken, a quarter cup of flour, 1 teaspoon salt, pepper, seasoned to taste, and lard. The instructions say to combine the 1 teaspoon of salt with the 1/4 cup of flour, add pepper to taste to the salt and flour mixture, coat the chicken with the flour, fry the coated chicken in hot lard until golden brown. This recipe, according to Lawson, contains some ambiguity, some vagueness, and some room for the cook to exercise some judgment. These are 3 elements of interpretation we can expect to find in the Constitution as well. For this, it'll be useful to know the difference between ambiguity and vagueness. Ambiguity means that a term has more than one clear meaning. For example, the term bank is ambiguous. It could either mean a financial institution, a place where people keep their money, or it could mean the edge of a river. How do you determine which meaning a person has in mind? You can't get the meaning from the term itself. You get it from the context in which the term is uttered. You ask which meaning makes sense in that context. If somebody says that they're going to stop by the bank and deposit a check, you don't expect to find them on the shore of the nearest river. What this means in terms of constitutional interpretation is that you cannot get all of the meanings by looking at the terms themselves. You have to look at the context in which the terms are being used, and that will allow you to better determine its meaning. Lawson tells us that in the chicken recipe, the phrase fry the coated chicken in hot lard until golden brown is ambiguous. But until what is golden brown, the chicken or the lard? Obviously, our understanding of chicken recipes makes it clear that it's the chicken that's supposed to be golden brown. But we don't get this from the words alone. We get it from the words plus the context. In contrast with ambiguity, when you call a term vague, it means that the term has no clear-cut boundaries. Take, for example, the phrase from the recipe golden brown. The boundary between golden brown and other colors isn't clearly defined. When asked, is this golden brown, there's a range of options where one might think maybe it is, maybe it isn't. In constitutional interpretation, we also find terms that are not clearly defined. Cruel and unusual punishment, for example. This allows for some flexibility in what counts as following the instructions. In some places, the chicken recipe leaves the decision up to the cook's discretion. An example of this may be the phrase, add pepper to taste. But this phrase also has some ambiguity. Whose tastes? Those are the people who will be eating the chicken? The chef's taste? Or the taste of those who wrote the recipe? Now, there's a type of originalism that seems to say that it's the taste of those who wrote the recipe that matters. Or, in the case of constitutional interpretation, the preferences of those who wrote the Constitution. This would involve an inquiry into how much pepper those who wrote the recipe would have added. So, briefly, first, we determine what the Constitution says. Second, we determine whether we should follow the Constitution. By analogy, what does the recipe tell us to do, and should we follow the recipe? In the recipe example, Lawson reports that a 1/4 cup of flour is not sufficient for coating 2.5 pounds of chicken. It would take 1/2 to 3/4 of a cup of flour. So, should one follow the recipe if it fails to produce good chicken? If you're cooking a meal for you and your family, then it's not so important that you follow the recipe. But what if the recipe belongs to an international chain of restaurants and people expect the same food regardless of where they are? It is important then that everybody follow the same recipe. This is what may be called a coordination problem. In the case of the Constitution, we clearly have a coordination problem. We need everybody in the country following the same instructions. This means that we can't allow judges to change the Constitution to suit their individual or regional preferences. Now, let us imagine in the case of the recipe that there's a procedure by which the company authorizes changes in the recipe. Perhaps the recipe can be changed for the entire chain by the agreement of 2/3 of the board of directors and the approval of 3/4 of the head chefs in the various restaurants. In the case of the Constitution, the procedure for amending the Constitution is to obtain a 2/3 vote in the House and Senate and ratification by 3/4 of all the states. This handles the coordination problem and helps to ensure that everybody is following the same recipe. For an originalist, this is the only legitimate way to change the Constitution. Now I want to look at another type of originalism called original intent. Instead of looking at the original public meaning of the words and phrases at the time the recipe is written, original intent asks what the authors wanted to say. This allows for the possibility that the authors gave poor instructions. If the instructions tell us something that the authors didn't want, we go with what the authors want, not with the literal instructions. Now again, imagine you're at a job and the boss sends you some email instructions. The instructions say to delete a set of files from the computer by the end of the day. Your boss is boarding a flight to Paris and can't be reached for the next 14 hours. You realize that if you delete one of the files, it would bring the whole system down, destroy terabytes of data in a way that is unrecoverable. Do you follow the instructions? Okay, let's also add the assumption that you like your job, you're basically treated well, and you have an interest in the company doing well. I can imagine somebody answering this by saying, take that. First, let's review Lawson's chicken recipe analogy. We're interpreting a recipe for fried chicken written around 1790. To answer the question, what does a recipe say, one looks at the original public meaning of the terms and phrases. Where the recipe says to add a quarter cup of flour, one looks at what the phrase quarter cup of flour would mean to somebody reading the recipe in 1790. The same is true of the Constitution. A constitution, according to Lawson, is a recipe for a government. To understand what the recipe tells us to do, we look at the original public meaning of the words and phrases, the way somebody living at the same time would interpret those instructions. In Lawson's own description, he says that a quarter cup of flour is not enough for 2.5 pounds of chicken, that a half to 3/4 would work better. But to change from 1/4 to 3/4 is to change the recipe. But is it? In contrast to Lawson, Pohlman argues that a proper interpretation of the chicken recipe would have us consider evidence regarding what the authors intended to say. If a quarter cup of flour is clearly not enough, then perhaps we should interpret this as a typographical error or a mistake. What if nobody at the time actually used a quarter of a cup of flour, but always used a half to 3/4 of a cup? Can this be taken as evidence that the authors meant for us to use 3/4 of a cup as well? One of the ways in which we may need to look at the intentions of the author is to ask, who was their intended audience? Lawson seems to be assuming that the intended audience was the general public. That's why he argues that the meaning of the recipe is the general public meaning of its words and phrases. And from this, Lawson argues that using rosemary rather than pepper would not count as following the recipe. Pohlman asked us to consider, in contrast, the possibility that the authors were writing for a more restricted audience. Let's say that they were writing for the poultry chefs of America. An examination of the club's documents and records shows us that they used the term pepper to refer to any seasoning. For them, the instruction reads, add seasoning to taste. And under this interpretation, it would be perfectly legitimate to add rosemary to taste. Does this apply to interpreting the Constitution? Well, we can ask, was the Constitution written to be understood by the general public, in which case we use the general public meaning, or was it written to be understood by an educated elite, in which case one would use the educated elite meaning? Take these phrases, which are directly from the Constitution. Quote, the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended unless in cases of rebellion or invasion the public safety may require it. No bill of attainder or ex post facto law shall be passed. No capitation or other direct tax shall be laid unless in proportion to the census or enumeration hereinbefore directed to be taken. End quote. Does that sound like it was written for the general public? Now, if terms like bill of attainder and ex post facto were written for a particular audience of people educated in law, then should we appeal to the original public meaning, or should we look to the meaning that this term had among those same intellectuals? The lesson that Pohlman wants us to draw from this analogy is that we can't determine what the document means without looking at the intentions of the authors. And this determines what types of evidence we look at when interpreting the Constitution. For Lawson, our primary evidence would be dictionaries and the common public use of terms. For Pohlman, we look at the documents and statements of the educated elite when talking with each other. If that group of people used a term differently than the general public, we go with their meaning, not the general public meaning. I can actually give you an example of this from our class. I've said that I want you to present arguments. What does the term argument mean? The general public meaning of the term argument is two people yelling at each other. The philosopher's meaning of argument is a set of propositions where the conclusion is said to follow from the premises. When I ask you to present an argument, how would you interpret that request? Do you use the general public meaning of the term, or the meaning that the term has among philosophers? I'll tell you, if you use the public meaning, you can't expect to get a very good grade in this course. So let me summarize these two views. I've discussed two versions of originalism. We have the original public meaning version, where the meaning of a phrase is determined by what it would have meant to the general public in 1790. And we have the original intent version that considers how the authors intended their words to be interpreted by their intended audience. Now there's a set of questions that I want to leave you with here. Lawson's chicken recipe doesn't contain any normative claims of a type that's found in the Constitution. Now let's assume that you find a recipe written 250 years ago and it contains phrases like the following. Now use a chicken that has been killed in an inhumane manner or treated cruelly. Cook the chicken at a reasonable and prudent temperature. The right of the chef's choice of seasoning shall not be restricted. Now, how would Lawson or Pohlman have us handle these types of instructions?